When the call came at 3:47 a.m., Margaret Whitmore knew that her carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The voice on the other end was clinical, professional, but the words hit her like a physical blow. "Mrs. Whitmore, your daughter Emma has been in an accident. She's in surgery now." The sterile fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast everything in an unforgiving white glow as Margaret clutched her husband Robert's hand in the waiting room. Her daughter Emma, just 28 years old and full of life, was somewhere behind those heavy double doors fighting for her future. The accident had been sudden, unexpected. A drunk driver running a red light had changed everything in an instant. Margaret's mind raced through 1,000 memories as she sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair. Emma's first steps, her graduation day, her wedding just 6 months ago to David, her bright laugh that could light up any room. How had they gone from planning Emma's first anniversary celebration to sitting in a hospital corridor, not knowing if she would ever walk again? The hours stretched endlessly. Robert tried to stay strong, pacing the hallway and making phone calls to family members, but Margaret could see the fear in his eyes every time he looked at her. They had been married for 32 years, raised 3 children together, but nothing had prepared them for this moment of helplessness. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the surgical wing at 8:30 a.m., her scrubs wrinkled and exhaustion evident in her features. Margaret's heart stopped as she tried to read the surgeon's expression. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," Dr. Chen began carefully. "We were able to repair the damage to Emma's spine, but..." The word "but" hung in the air like a storm cloud. Margaret felt Robert's hand tighten around hers as they waited for the rest of the news that would determine their daughter's future. Dr. Chen continued gently, "The next 72 hours will be critical. We won't know the full extent of the neurological impact until the swelling goes down. She's stable, but we need to prepare for the possibility of permanent mobility issues." Margaret's world tilted. Her strong, athletic daughter who had run marathons and climbed mountains might never walk again. The weight of that possibility crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had always been the rock of their family, the one who held everyone together during tough times, but, in that moment, she felt herself beginning to crack. "Can we see her?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's in recovery now. Give us another hour to get her settled in the ICU, and then you can visit briefly. I want to prepare you. She's unconscious and will be for several more hours. There are a lot of machines, a lot of tubes. It can be overwhelming, but remember that each one is helping her heal." Margaret nodded numbly, unable to trust her voice. After Dr. Chen left, she and Robert sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. The waiting room gradually filled with other families facing their own crises, but Margaret felt completely alone in her bubble of terror and love. Emma's husband David arrived shortly after, his face pale and his hands shaking. He had been out of town on business when the accident happened and had driven through the night to get to the hospital. Margaret watched as Robert embraced his son-in-law, both men struggling to maintain their composure. David was a good man, devoted to Emma, but he was young and this kind of crisis would test anyone. "How is she? What did the doctors say?" David's questions tumbled out in a rush. Robert explained the situation as gently as possible, but Margaret could see David's face crumble with each detail. He sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. "This is my fault," he whispered. "I should have been here. I should have picked her up from work instead of letting her drive home alone." "Don't," Margaret said firmly, finding her voice for the first time in hours. "This is not your fault. This is not anyone's fault except the person who chose to drink and drive. Emma wouldn't want you to blame yourself." As they continued to wait, Margaret found herself thinking about all the plans they had made, all the dreams they had shared as a family. Emma and David had been trying to start a family. They had just bought their first house. Emma had been promoted at work and was excited about her new responsibilities. How much of that future was still possible? The hour felt like an eternity, but finally, a nurse came to escort them to the ICU. Margaret's legs felt unsteady as they walked down the long corridor. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her vibrant daughter lying motionless in that hospital bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and breathing tubes. Emma looked so small, so fragile, nothing like the confident woman who had called just 3 days ago to tell Margaret about her latest work project. Her face was peaceful but pale, and there were bandages and bruises that spoke to the violence of the accident. Margaret felt her knees buckle slightly, and Robert's steady hand on her back was the only thing that kept her upright. "You can talk to her," the nurse said softly. Many patients can hear their loved ones even when they're unconscious.
It can be very comforting.
Margaret approached the bed slowly, her heart breaking with each step. She reached out tentatively and touched Emma's hand, careful to avoid the foreline. Her daughter's skin was warm, which was somehow both reassuring and devastating at the same time. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her voice catching.
"Mom and Dad are here. David's here too.
"We're all here, and we're not going anywhere.
You just focus on getting better, okay? Just focus on coming back to us."
She squeezed Emma's hand gently and thought she felt the faintest pressure in return, but she couldn't be sure if it was real or just desperate hope. The machines continued their steady rhythm, marking time in this new reality where everything familiar had been stripped away. Robert moved to the other side of the bed and placed his hand on Emma's forehead, stroking her hair gently.
"We love you so much, Emma.
You're the strongest person we know, and you're going to get through this.
We're going to get through this together."
David stood at the foot of the bed, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said to Emma's still form.
"I'm sorry I let you down. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere.
We're going to face whatever comes next together, just like we promised." The nurse eventually guided them back to the waiting room, explaining that Emma needed rest and that they could visit again in a few hours. As they walked back down that endless corridor, Margaret felt the full weight of their new reality settling on her shoulders. This was just the beginning of a long, uncertain journey. Back in the waiting room, Margaret's sister Patricia arrived with coffee and sandwiches that no one wanted to eat. More family members trickled in throughout the day. Emma's younger brother Michael drove up from college, her older sister Sarah flew in from Seattle. The waiting room became a temporary headquarters for their family crisis, filled with hushed conversations and shared fears. As evening approached, Margaret realized that this hospital, with its antiseptic smells and constant activity, was going to become a second home for the foreseeable future. She thought about their house, sitting empty with Emma's car still in the driveway where the police had taken it after retrieving her personal belongings. She thought about Emma's office, where colleagues were probably wondering why she hadn't shown up for work. All the normal routines of life had been suspended, replaced by this strange new rhythm of waiting, hoping, and praying. Margaret had always been a planner, someone who liked to know what was coming next, but now they were living in a world of complete uncertainty where the only thing they could control was their presence and their love. As the first day in the hospital came to an end, Margaret looked around at her family gathered in that sterile waiting room and realized that despite the fear and uncertainty, they were together.
Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family.
Emma had raised her to be strong, and now it was time to be strong for Emma. The hardest part was not knowing what tomorrow would bring, but Margaret was beginning to understand that this was their new normal, taking each day, each hour, each moment as it came, and holding on to hope with everything they had. Margaret hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in 3 days. The hospital's family sleeping room had become her temporary home, with its narrow cot and thin blankets that smelled faintly of industrial detergent. Robert had tried to convince her to go home, to shower and rest in their own bed, but she couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital while Emma remained unconscious. On the morning of the 4th day, everything changed. Margaret was dozing in the chair beside Emma's bed when she heard a soft moan. Her eyes snapped open, immediately alert. She looked at her daughter's face and saw something that made her heart leap. Emma's eyelids were fluttering.
"Emma? Sweetheart, can you hear me?"
Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow push her daughter back into unconsciousness. Emma's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. She tried to speak but only managed a weak croak due to the breathing tube that had been removed just hours earlier. Margaret reached for the call button, her hands shaking with excitement and relief.
"It's okay, baby.
You're okay.
You're in the hospital, but you're going to be fine." Margaret's words tumbled out as she gently stroked Emma's hair. "Don't try to talk yet. Just rest."
Dr. Chen arrived within minutes, followed by a team of nurses. Margaret reluctantly stepped back to give them room to work, but she kept her eyes locked on Emma's face, watching as her daughter slowly became more aware of her surroundings.
"Emma, I'm Dr. Chen.
You were in a car accident, and you've been in surgery."
"Can you tell me your name?" the doctor asked gently.
"Emma," came the hoarse whisper.
"Emma Whitmore Patterson." "Good. Do you know what year it is?" 2024. "Excellent. How do you feel?" Any pain? Emma's forehead creased slightly. My back, can't feel my legs.
Margaret's heart clenched as she watched her daughter's face register confusion and, then, growing alarm.
Dr. Chan remained calm and professional. That's expected right now, Emma.
There's still significant swelling around your spinal cord from the surgery. We need to give your body time to heal before we can determine the extent of any long-term effects. But Margaret could see the fear creeping into Emma's eyes as the reality of her situation began to sink in. When David arrived 20 minutes later, he rushed to Emma's bedside with tears of joy and relief streaming down his face.
Oh, thank God, he breathed, taking her hand carefully. I've been so scared. Emma managed a weak smile.
Sorry to scare you.
Don't apologize. Don't ever apologize. I'm just so glad you're awake. I love you so much.
Over the next few hours, as Emma became more alert, the questions began. She wanted to know about the accident, about her injuries, about what the doctors weren't telling her. Margaret watched her daughter transform from relief at being alive to growing anxiety about what her life might look like going forward. Dr. Chen was honest but gentle when Emma pressed for details about her prognosis.
The surgery went very well.
We were able to repair the damage to your L2 and L3 vertebrae. The good news is that the injury was incomplete, which means there's still potential for recovery.
The challenging news is that we won't know the full extent of your recovery for several weeks or even months. But, I might walk again? Emma's voice was small, hopeful. There's definitely a possibility.
We'll begin physical therapy assessments as soon as the swelling reduces and you're strong enough. Every spinal cord injury is different, and recovery can surprise us. Margaret could see Emma processing this information, her analytical mind working through the implications. Emma had always been the type of person who needed to understand exactly what she was facing, to have a plan and goals to work toward.
What about work? What about? Emma's voice trailed off as she looked at David.
Margaret knew she was thinking about all the plans they had made, all the dreams that now hung in the balance. One step at a time, David said firmly.
Right now, we just focus on getting you stronger. Everything else will work itself out.
But Margaret could see that Emma wasn't satisfied with that answer. She had always been driven, ambitious, someone who thrived on being in control of her destiny.
This forced passivity, this uncertainty, would be almost as difficult for her as any physical challenges.
As the day progressed, more family members visited. Emma's brother Michael broke down crying when he saw her awake, and her sister Sarah flew back from her business trip to spend time at the hospital. The room filled with flowers, cards, and an outpouring of love from friends and colleagues who had heard about the accident. Emma seemed overwhelmed by all the attention at first, but Margaret could see that it was also comforting for her to realize how many people cared about her recovery. Her best friend Jessica brought photos from Emma's recent birthday party, and they spent an hour looking through them together, remembering happier times.
But, as evening approached and the visitors left, Margaret noticed Emma becoming quieter, more withdrawn.
She was staring at the ceiling, and Margaret could practically see the wheels turning in her daughter's mind.
What are you thinking about, sweetheart?
Margaret asked, settling into the chair beside the bed.
Everything, Emma said simply. How is this going to change everything?
It doesn't have to change who you are, Margaret said carefully.
You're still the same strong, brilliant, beautiful person you've always been. But what if I can't walk, Mom? What if I can't have children? What if David realizes he didn't sign up for this and... Emma's voice broke.
Stop, David said firmly from his position in the corner chair where he'd been dozing.
Don't you dare think like that. I married you for better or worse, in sickness and in health, remember?
This is just the worst part, and we're going to get through it together. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at the conviction in David's voice. She had always known he was a good man, but seeing him now, exhausted and scared but absolutely unwavering in his commitment to Emma, made her realize what a truly exceptional person her daughter had married. Besides, David continued, moving to sit on the edge of the bed, you're not getting rid of me that easily. I've invested too much time training you to appreciate my cooking to give up now. Emma managed a small laugh, the first one Margaret had heard since the accident.
Your cooking is terrible. Exactly. Who else is going to put up with it?
As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself marveling at the resilience she was already seeing in her daughter. Yes, Emma was scared and uncertain, but she was also asking practical questions about rehabilitation, about adaptive equipment, about what her recovery timeline might look like.
She was already beginning to fight.
Dr. Chen stopped by during evening rounds and was pleased with Emma's neurological responses. "We'll start with some basic mobility assessments tomorrow," she explained. "Nothing too strenuous, but we want to begin understanding what function you currently have and what we can work on improving."
"Will you be honest with me about the results?" Emma asked.
"Always. I believe in giving my patients complete information so they can make informed decisions about their care." Margaret appreciated the doctor's directness. Emma had always responded better to honesty than false reassurance, and it was clear that Dr. Chen understood that about her patient. After the doctor left, Margaret helped Emma with her dinner, cutting up food and holding the cup while Emma drank through a straw. It was such a simple thing, helping her daughter eat, but it reminded Margaret of when Emma was small and dependent on her for everything. There was something both heartbreaking and precious about being needed in this way again. "Mom, I need you to do something for me," Emma said as Margaret was cleaning up the dinner tray.
"Anything, sweetheart? I need you to go home tonight. Really go home. Shower, sleep in your own bed, check on the house.
You look exhausted, and I need you to take care of yourself." Margaret started to protest, but Emma cut her off.
"I'm serious.
I'm stable now, and David's staying overnight. I need to know that you're taking care of yourself, or I'm going to worry about you instead of focusing on getting better." Margaret realized that her daughter was right. She had been so focused on being strong for Emma that she hadn't considered how her own exhaustion might be affecting her ability to provide support. "Okay," she agreed reluctantly.
"But I'll be back first thing in the morning." "I know you will. You couldn't stay away if you tried."
Robert had been quiet for most of the day, letting Margaret take the lead in conversations with Emma, but now he moved to his daughter's bedside.
"I'm proud of you, sweetheart.
I know today was overwhelming, but you handled it with such grace." "I don't feel very graceful, Dad.
I feel scared and confused and angry." "That's okay too. You're allowed to feel all of those things.
This is a lot to process, and you don't have to be perfect or positive all the time." Margaret watched this exchange between her husband and daughter and felt a surge of love and gratitude. Robert had always been Emma's champion, always believed in her ability to overcome any challenge. His steady presence and unwavering faith in her strength would be crucial in the difficult months ahead. As they prepared to leave for the night, Margaret kissed Emma's forehead and whispered, "I love you more than you'll ever know."
"I love you too, Mom. Thank you for staying with me. There's nowhere else I'd rather be."
Walking out of the hospital that night felt strange after spending so many days within its walls. The outside world seemed too bright, too normal, too unconcerned with their family crisis. Margaret realized that while their world had been completely transformed, life everywhere else had continued on as usual. During the drive home, Margaret found herself thinking about the long road ahead. Emma's awakening was just the first step in what would likely be months of rehabilitation and adjustment. There would be setbacks and breakthroughs, frustrations and victories. But seeing her daughter's determination already beginning to emerge gave Margaret hope that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The house felt eerily quiet when they arrived. Emma's car keys still sat on the kitchen counter where she had left them before taking her friend's car that fateful night. Her coffee mug was still in the sink, unwashed from her last morning at home. These small reminders of normal life felt both precious and painful. As Margaret finally fell asleep in her own bed, she thought about Emma's question, how was this going to change everything? The truth was, she didn't know. But she was beginning to understand that change didn't necessarily mean ending. It might just mean beginning something new, something different, something they couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new information, new steps forward or backward. But tonight, Emma was alive, she was awake, and she was fighting. For now, that was enough. 2 weeks had passed since Emma first opened her eyes, and the hospital had become a strange kind of second home for the Whitmore family. Margaret had established a routine of arriving at 7 each morning with fresh coffee and staying until evening visiting hours ended. She had learned to navigate the maze of corridors, knew which elevator was fastest, and could read the subtle signs in Dr. Chen's expressions that indicated good news or concern. Today was different.
Today was the day of Emma's first comprehensive mobility assessment, and the entire family was gathered to hear the results.
Margaret sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Emma's bed, trying to appear calm while her heart raced with anticipation and fear. Physical therapist Mark Rodriguez had been working with Emma for 3 days now, conducting tests that seemed simple but carried enormous implications.
Could Emma feel a pin prick on her thigh? Could she move her toes? Could she sense when her leg was being moved?
Each tiny response was catalogued and analyzed, building a picture of what Emma's future might hold. "The results are more encouraging than I initially expected," Dr. Chen announced as she entered the room with Mark and the rest of the medical team. Margaret felt Robert's hand squeeze hers tightly.
"What does that mean exactly?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety Margaret could see in her eyes. Mark stepped forward with a warm smile. "It means you have more sensation and muscle function than we typically see with this type of injury. You have partial feeling in both legs, and we've detected muscle activity in several key groups." "So I can walk again?"
The hope in Emma's voice was almost painful to hear. "We believe you'll regain significant mobility," Dr. Chen said carefully. "It's going to take time, intensive rehabilitation, and a lot of hard work, but, yes, we're optimistic about your recovery." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched Emma's face transform with relief and determination. David let out a shaky breath and reached for Emma's hand.
"What's the timeline?" Emma asked immediately. "When can I start therapy? What do I need to do?" Mark laughed gently. "That's the attitude we like to hear.
We can start intensive physical therapy as soon as you're discharged from the hospital, probably in another week. Initially, we'll focus on strengthening the muscles that are working and retraining your nervous system to communicate with your legs."
"I want to start now," Emma said firmly. "Today. This morning."
"Emma," Margaret interjected gently, "you need to let your body heal properly."
"Mom, I've been lying in this bed for 2 weeks. I'm ready to start fighting back." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly.
"That determination is going to serve you well, Emma. We can certainly begin with some basic exercises today, as long as you promise to listen to your body and not push too hard too fast." Over the next hour, Margaret watched as Mark guided Emma through simple exercises. The sight of her daughter struggling to lift her leg just a few inches off the bed was both heartbreaking and inspiring.
Emma's face was flushed with effort, sweat beading on her forehead from the exertion of movements that had once been automatic.
"That's excellent, Emma," Mark encouraged.
"You're already showing improvement from Monday." "It doesn't feel like improvement," Emma panted. "Everything feels so heavy." "That's normal.
Your neural pathways are essentially relearning how to communicate with your muscles.
Every small movement you make is rebuilding those connections."
Margaret could see the frustration in Emma's eyes, but also the fierce determination that had always defined her daughter.
Emma had never been one to back down from a challenge, whether it was learning to ride a bike, studying for exams, or climbing mountains with David.
This would be her greatest challenge yet, but Margaret had no doubt that Emma would approach it with the same relentless drive. After the therapy session, Emma was exhausted but energized in a way Margaret hadn't seen since the accident. She spent the afternoon researching spinal cord rehabilitation online, making lists of questions for her medical team, and planning her recovery timeline with the same methodical approach she had once applied to work projects.
"I want to be walking again by Christmas," Emma announced to the family that evening. "Sweetheart," Robert said gently, "that's only 4 months away. Maybe you should set more modest goals to start with." "No, Dad. I need something to aim for. Something specific and challenging."
Emma's jaw was set in that stubborn way Margaret remembered from her teenage years. Mark said intensive rehabilitation could show significant results in 3 to 6 months.
"Christmas gives me exactly 5 months.
David looked concerned.
What if you don't meet that timeline? I don't want you to feel like you failed if progress is slower than expected. Then, I'll reassess and set a new goal."
"But I'm not going to aim low just because it feels safer." Margaret understood her daughter's need for concrete objectives, but she also worried about the pressure Emma was putting on herself. She had always been a perfectionist, someone who achieved whatever she set her mind to, but this was different. This recovery would be full of setbacks and plateaus, victories and defeats that were largely beyond Emma's control.
The next few days brought a new routine.
Emma was transferred to the rehabilitation wing of the hospital, where the focus shifted from medical care to intensive therapy. Margaret watched her daughter throw herself into the work with characteristic intensity, pushing herself through exercises that looked exhausting and, occasionally, painful.
The physical therapists worked with Emma on everything from basic muscle strengthening to balance training.
Occupational therapists helped her relearn everyday tasks and introduced her to adaptive equipment that could help her maintain independence. The days were long and demanding, but Emma approached each session with grim determination. "She's pushing herself too hard," Margaret confided to Robert one evening as they watched Emma struggle through a particularly challenging exercise. "She needs to push herself," Robert replied. "That's who she is.
If we try to hold her back now, she'll resent us for it later."
Margaret knew he was right, but it was difficult to watch her daughter strain and struggle, especially when she could see the frustration building in Emma's eyes during the sessions when progress felt minimal.
The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon during week 3 of rehabilitation.
Margaret was sitting in her usual corner chair, reading a magazine while Emma worked with Mark on standing exercises using parallel bars for support. Emma had been able to pull herself to standing several times before, but her legs had always buckled immediately.
This time was different.
Emma gripped the bars, pulled herself up with her arms, and then, something clicked.
Her legs held her weight for nearly 10 seconds before she needed to sit back down. "Did you see that?" Emma's voice was breathless with excitement. "Did everyone see that?"
"We saw it," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face.
"We all saw it."
Mark was grinning widely.
"That was fantastic, Emma. Absolutely fantastic."
But the most meaningful reaction came from David, who had been quiet in the corner, watching every session with intense focus.
He walked over to Emma and gently kissed her forehead. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "So incredibly proud."
That evening, Emma called her siblings to share the news. Margaret listened as her daughter's voice bubbled with excitement, describing the sensation of standing on her own again, making plans for the next milestone she wanted to reach. The room felt lighter somehow, filled with hope and possibility in a way it hadn't since the accident.
But the next day brought a stark reminder that recovery wasn't linear. Emma couldn't repeat her standing success, despite multiple attempts.
Her legs felt weak and unresponsive, and, by the end of the session, she was fighting back tears of frustration. "This is normal," Mark assured her.
"Recovery happens in waves, not a straight line."
"Yesterday was a glimpse of what's possible. Today is your body saying it needs more time to build strength." "I hate this," Emma said quietly after Mark left. "I hate not being able to control my own body." Margaret moved to sit beside her daughter on the therapy mat.
"I know, sweetheart. But you're doing something incredible here. You're literally rebuilding yourself. What if I never get better than this? What if yesterday was a fluke?"
"Then, we'll figure out how to live with that," Margaret said firmly.
"But I don't think it was a fluke. I think yesterday was a preview of what's coming."
Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder, and, for a moment, she wasn't the determined, driven woman pushing herself through rehabilitation. She was just Margaret's daughter, scared and uncertain and needing comfort. "I keep thinking about everything David and I planned," Emma said softly. "The house we bought, the family we wanted to start, the trips we wanted to take.
What if none of that is possible anymore?"
"Maybe some things will be different than you planned," Margaret acknowledged.
"But different doesn't mean impossible. Different doesn't mean less meaningful or less beautiful. How can you be so sure?"
Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking about her own life, the unexpected turns and challenges that had ultimately led to joy she never could have anticipated. "Because I've learned that the most important things in life, love, family, purpose, joy, those things aren't dependent on specific circumstances. They're dependent on the choices we make and the people we choose to make them with." Emma was quiet for a long time, processing her mother's words. Finally, she straightened up with renewed resolve.
"I want to try standing again tomorrow." "Of course you do," Margaret smiled. "And I'll be right here cheering you on." As they prepared to leave the hospital that evening, Margaret reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. Emma was still facing enormous challenges, still had months of difficult rehabilitation ahead, but something fundamental had shifted. The despair and uncertainty that had characterized those first days had been replaced by determination and hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, with setbacks and frustrations that would test Emma's resolve and the family's strength.
But Margaret was beginning to believe that they would not just survive this crisis, they would emerge from it stronger, closer, and more grateful for the precious gift of each day together. Emma's journey back to mobility had only just begun, but she was no longer just a patient hoping for recovery. She had become a fighter, determined to reclaim her life and redefine what was possible. And Margaret couldn't wait to see what her remarkable daughter would achieve.
The day Emma was discharged from the hospital marked both an ending and a beginning.
After 6 weeks of sterile corridors and constant medical supervision, the prospect of going home felt like stepping into an unknown world. Margaret watched as David carefully transferred Emma from the hospital wheelchair to their car, noting how naturally he had learned to provide support without making Emma feel helpless. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Emma stared out the window at the familiar streets of their neighborhood, seeing everything with new eyes. Simple things like curbs, stairs, and narrow doorways had taken on new significance. The world had become a series of obstacles and accessibility challenges that she was only beginning to understand.
"The ramp looks perfect," Emma said as they pulled into the driveway.
Robert and David had spent the previous weekend installing a temporary ramp over the front steps, and Margaret could see the relief in Emma's eyes as she realized she could access her own home independently. Inside, the house had been transformed. Furniture had been rearranged to create wider pathways, grab bars had been installed in the bathrooms, and Emma's office had been converted into a bedroom to eliminate the need to navigate stairs.
It was still their home, but it was different now, adapted to accommodate Emma's current needs.
"It looks good," Emma said, wheeling herself through the living room.
"Different, but good."
Margaret could hear the forced positivity in her daughter's voice and recognized the complex emotions Emma must be feeling. This was supposed to be a homecoming, a celebration, but it was also a stark reminder of how much their lives had changed. The first few days at home were challenging in ways none of them had anticipated. In the hospital, Emma had been surrounded by medical professionals who understood spinal cord injuries and knew exactly how to help. At home, they were learning together through trial and error.
Simple tasks became complicated endeavors.
Getting in and out of the shower required careful coordination and took 3 times as long as before.
Cooking dinner meant rearranging the entire kitchen to make everything accessible from a seated position. Even something as basic as getting dressed could become frustrating when clothes didn't fit properly over leg braces and medical equipment.
Margaret found herself walking a careful line between offering help and respecting Emma's fierce desire for independence. There were moments when she wanted to step in and assist, but she had learned to wait for Emma to ask rather than assuming she needed help. "I can do it myself, Mom," became Emma's most frequent phrase, spoken with varying degrees of patience depending on how her day had gone. Margaret understood that this independence was crucial to Emma's emotional recovery, even when it meant watching her daughter struggle with tasks that could be completed more quickly with assistance.
The outpatient rehabilitation schedule was intensive.
3 days a week, Emma traveled to the rehabilitation center for physical therapy, occupational therapy, and counseling sessions. The other days were filled with home exercises and practice sessions that often left Emma exhausted and frustrated. Progress was measured in increments that seemed impossibly small to everyone except the medical professionals.
Standing for 30 seconds instead of 20 was cause for celebration.
Taking 3 steps with a walker instead of 2 was a major milestone. Margaret learned to find joy in these tiny victories while supporting Emma through the inevitable setbacks. "I hate this," Emma announced one afternoon after a particularly difficult therapy session. She had been working on transferring from her wheelchair to a regular chair, a skill that seemed simple but required complex coordination of balance, strength, and timing. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said, settling onto the couch beside Emma's wheelchair.
"Do you want to talk about what's frustrating you the most?"
"Everything. I'm tired of being tired all the time.
I'm tired of every simple thing taking forever. I'm tired of people looking at me like I'm broken."
Margaret's heart ached for her daughter's frustration. Emma had always been someone who excelled at everything she attempted, and this slow, uncertain progress was completely foreign to her experience. "You're not broken," Margaret said firmly.
"You're healing. And healing takes time. What if this is as good as it gets? What if I never walk normally again? What if David and I can never have the family we planned?"
These were the questions that haunted all of them, though they rarely spoke them aloud.
Margaret understood that Emma needed to voice these fears in order to process them.
"Then, we'll figure out how to build a beautiful life with whatever abilities you have," Margaret said. And, as for children, the doctors have said there's no medical reason you can't have a family. It might look different than you originally planned, but it's still possible. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap.
Sometimes I feel like I'm grieving for my old life, for the person I used to be. Is that wrong?
It's not wrong at all, Margaret assured her.
It's healthy. You are grieving, and that's okay.
You lost something important, and it's natural to mourn that loss even while you're working toward recovery.
This conversation marked a turning point in Emma's emotional healing.
She began attending a support group for people with spinal cord injuries, where she could share her fears and frustrations with others who truly understood her experience. Margaret watched as Emma gradually began to build connections with people who had learned to thrive despite similar challenges. One particularly meaningful friendship developed with Sarah Martinez, a woman who had been paralyzed in a climbing accident 5 years earlier. Sarah had not only returned to her career as a graphic designer but had also completed a marathon in her racing wheelchair and recently gotten married. She makes it look so normal, Emma told Margaret after their first coffee meeting. Like having a disability is just one aspect of who she is, not the defining characteristic. That's because it is just one aspect, Margaret replied. Just like being tall or having brown hair or being good at math.
It's part of the whole person, but it's not the whole person. As autumn progressed, Emma's physical progress continued at a steady pace.
She graduated from using a walker to using forearm crutches for short distances. She could transfer independently between her wheelchair and bed, car, and most chairs. Her stamina improved to the point where she could participate in normal daily activities without becoming completely exhausted.
More importantly, her emotional resilience was strengthening as well.
She began talking about returning to work, initially part-time from home. She started researching adaptive sports programs and found a wheelchair basketball team that practiced at a nearby community center. The breakthrough Margaret had been hoping for came on a crisp October morning during Emma's therapy session. Margaret was reading in the waiting area when Mark burst through the doors with a huge grin on his face. "Mrs. Whitmore, you need to come see this," he said excitedly. Margaret hurried into the therapy room to find Emma standing between the parallel bars, but this time was different. Instead of supporting all her weight with her arms, Emma was actually walking.
Slowly, shakily, with obvious effort, but walking.
"Oh my God," Margaret breathed, tears immediately springing to her eyes.
"Emma, you're walking."
"It's just a few steps," Emma panted, but her face was radiant with accomplishment.
"But they're real steps. I'm holding my own weight."
Margaret watched as Emma took 6 careful steps down the length of the parallel bars before needing to rest. It wasn't the fluid, confident stride Emma had once possessed, but it was walking.
Real, independent walking. David arrived just as Emma was completing her second attempt at the walking exercise.
Margaret would never forget the expression on his face as he watched his wife take those precious, hard-won steps. "How do you feel?" he asked Emma after she had settled back into her wheelchair, breathless but glowing with achievement.
"Like I just climbed Mount Everest," Emma laughed.
"Exhausted and exhilarated and proud and terrified all at the same time."
"That's exactly how you should feel," Mark said.
"What you just did was incredible. We'll start incorporating walking practice into your regular therapy routine, building up your endurance and stability." The news of Emma's walking breakthrough spread quickly through their family and circle of friends. The house filled with congratulatory flowers, cards, and phone calls. Emma's siblings made special trips to witness this milestone in person, and her co-workers sent a celebration cake with our hero written in frosting. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Emma's support group. Sarah Martinez sent a simple text message that read, "I told you this day would come. So proud of you." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner to celebrate Emma's achievement, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey they had all taken together. 6 months ago, they had been sitting in a hospital waiting room, not knowing if Emma would survive. Now they were celebrating her return to walking, planning her gradual return to work, and talking about the future with hope and excitement. Emma was not the same person she had been before the accident, and perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The trauma had revealed depths of strength and resilience that she might never have discovered otherwise. She had developed empathy and patience that came from experiencing vulnerability and dependence. She had learned to find joy in small victories and to appreciate abilities she had once taken for granted.
"What are you thinking about, Mom?" Emma asked, noticing Margaret's contemplative mood. Just how proud I am of you. How proud I am of all of us, actually.
We've been through something terrible together, and we've come out stronger.
We're not done yet, Emma said.
I've still got a lot of work to do before I can call myself fully recovered.
Maybe, Margaret replied. But I'm beginning to think recovery isn't about getting back to exactly where you were before. Maybe it's about becoming something new, something better. Emma considered this thoughtfully. You might be right.
I certainly never appreciated the simple act of walking as much as I do now. As they continued their dinner conversation, making plans for Emma's continued rehabilitation and gradual return to normal activities, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude for the strength of their family bonds and the resilience of the human spirit. The road had been long and difficult, with many challenges still ahead, but they had proven that love and determination could overcome even the most devastating circumstances. Emma's journey was far from over, but she was no longer just surviving her injuries. She was learning to thrive with them, to build a life that was different from what she had planned but no less meaningful or joyful. And Margaret couldn't wait to see what new adventures lay ahead for her remarkable daughter.